Hey everybody, so we are back in October Sky and we are reading chapter 5 today entitled Quentin. And if you'll remember in the last chapter, Sonny got picked on by some people and so did the other Rocket boys, one of them namely being Buck Trant, one of Jim's fellow football players. And so Roy Lee came up to him and said, you know what, we're not going to build rockets anymore. I think they just couldn't handle it. So Sonny is determined that, yes, they are going to build rockets, or he is anyway. So he has decided he needs to speak with Quentin. So in Chapter 5, we are going to find out who Quentin is. We are on page 71, so get ready. So Quentin was the class joke. He used a lot of big words, often delivered in a pseudo-English accent, and he carried around an old cracked leather briefcase, stuffed to overflowing with books and who knew what else. While the rest of us played dodgeball or did calisthenics in phys ed, he always had some excuse not to participate, a sprained ankle or a headache or some such, and sat in the bleachers and read one of his books. While all the other students traded gossip and nonsense in the auditorium in the morning or at lunch, Quentin always sat alone. He had no friends as far as I could tell. Although everybody, including me, made fun of him, I was pretty certain he was some sort of a genius. He could expound on nearly any subject in class until the teacher had to ask him to stop. And if he'd ever made less than 100 on a test, I wasn't aware of it. I figured if there was anybody who might know how to build a rocket, it was Quentin. The next morning before classes, I sat down beside him in the auditorium. Startled, he pulled his book down from his face. "I don't let anybody copy my homework," he said suspiciously. "I don't want to copy your homework," I replied, although I would have taken his algebra if he'd offered. "Do you know anything about rockets?" And we are at the top of 72. A little smile crossed his face. Quentin wasn't a bad-looking kid for a genius. He had a narrow face, a sharp nose, crisp blue eyes, and jet-black hair that looked as if it had been plastered down with about a quart of wild root cream oil. "I wondered how long it would take for you to come to me with that question. I heard about your rocket, old boy. Blew up, did it? What made you think you could build a rocket? You can't even do algebra." "I'm getting better," I muttered. It was amazing to me that everybody, even Quentin, knew my business. "One of my little sisters can already do algebra," he advised me. "I taught her. It's really quite simple." In less than a minute, he had already pretty much irritated me. "So what do you know about rockets?" I asked him. "Anything?" "I know everything," he replied. He said it too easily. "Let's hear it then," I said, doubtfully. He raised one of his bony shoulders in a shrug. "What's in it for me?" "What do you want?" "To help you build the next one." That was a surprise. "If you know so much, why don't you build your own?" I demanded. Quentin built a little church with his hands. "I've considered building a rocket for some time. If you must know, practical reasons, unfortunately, have prevented me from taking action. It takes teamwork to build a rocket, and materials. My observation of you is that you have certain leadership abilities that I do not." He locked his eyes on me. They were intense, almost like they were capable of shooting rays. "The other boys will follow you," he said. "And you, being the Colwood superintendent's son, can probably get all the materials you need." His ray gun eyes made me want to look away, but I didn't. "What's your angle?" I demanded. "Ho, ho," he exclaimed. "The same as you, old chap. If I learn how to build a rocket, I'll stand a better chance of getting on down at the Cape." "First, you've got to go to college," I reminded him. "I'll go to college," he said resolutely, "but it won't hurt to get some good practical rocket building experience under my belt." He put out his hand. "How about you? You want to team up?" It was the best offer I'd gotten since I'd started my rocket building career, but I was still a little reluctant. I didn't have much of a reputation at Big Creek, but it was still better than Quentin's. When I didn't respond to his hand, he grabbed mine and shook it. Big strokes up and down. I hastily pulled my hand away and looked around to see if anybody had noticed. I knew the football boys would accuse me of holding hands with Quentin if any one of them had seen it. "So what do you know?" I demanded, my face flushed with the potential embarrassment of it all. "Calm down, old chap," he said. "All shall become perfectly clear." He leaned back and took a deep breath and then began to talk just as if he was reading something straight from a book. The Chinese are reputed to have invented rocketry. Something called Chinese arrows are mentioned in Europe and the Middle East as far back as the 13th century. The British used rockets later aboard ships during the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812. That's where the rocket's red glare comes from in the Star-Spangled Banner. Then there was the Russian Tolskovsky, Goddard the American, and von Braun, of course, each of them added to the body of rocket knowledge. Tolskovsky was a theorist. Goddard applied in engineering principles, and I stopped him. I don't need to know this stuff. I just need to know how a rocket works. Quentin cocked his head. But that's so elementary. Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. I remembered from one science class or another something about Newton, but I couldn't put my finger on his laws. How do you know that? I read it somewhere. Read it where? Quentin frowned, disturbed at my attempt to cut through his bull. A physics book, I suppose, he said stiffly. Can't exactly say which one. I thumb over to Welch every Saturday to the county library. I tend to pick out random shelves and just read every book on it until I'm done. I could see it was going to be necessary to be more specific with Quentin. What kind of fuel does a rocket use? The Chinese use black powder. Black powder. He looked at me carefully as if to determine if I was joking. Black powder. It contains potassium nitrate, saltpeter, you know, and charcoal and sulfur. Saltpeter, Quentin sighed, and then explained in some detail the chemical's properties. It was an oxidizer which, when combined with other chemicals, produced heat and gas necessary to make a rocket fly. It can also kill you down there. He finished up, pointing at his crotch. What do you mean? It fixes men so they can't, you know. So there are several things I want to point out. So, of course, you need to know that Quentin is the smart boy in the school. And people are usually embarrassed to be friends with him if they want to be cool because he's kind of looked at as a nerd. Also, you need to know that, Quentin wants something out of this too. And so when they were talking about it on page 72 is where it was talking about it. Quentin wants to help him build it. But the reason he needs Sonny as much as Sonny needs him, Sonny needs Quentin because Quentin has the intelligence to help him figure out how to build this rocket, right? But the reason Quentin needs Sonny is that he's got this personality, and it says there on page 72 that other boys will follow Sonny. And so Quentin knows by working with Sonny, he'll get the help he needs because people probably wouldn't listen to just Quentin, but Quentin and Sonny as a team can get further. And also because at the top of 73, because Sonny is the Coldwood superintendent's son, he'd be able to get the materials that they need. So basically, Quentin's willing to work with him because he wants to be able to build rockets too, because he's hoping that if they're successful in doing this, it will help them get to college because, of course, we know they're not going to be able to get a football scholarship. So they need each other. And then on 74, do mark, which is close to the beginning of that page, Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. You want to mark that. And you want to also mark that they were wondering what kind of fuel the Chinese would use with their rockets. Lower down on 74, that they use black powder. You need to know that it contains potassium nitrate, saltpeter, and charcoal and sulfur. And he further down explains that saltpeter is an oxidizer, which combined with other chemicals produces heat and gas necessary to make a rocket fly. So that's several things I've pointed out that you need to know. Most of the things are on page 74, but a few things are on 72 and at the very top of 73. So you want to mark those things. Okay? So, anyway, we are now at the top of page 75. So what he was saying is if saltpeter gets on a guy down there, it kind of makes them not be able to do anything. So at the top of 75, he goes, what? And Quentin flushed, He straightened a crooked finger. That? Really? Well, that's what I read. I thought I'd better get back to rockets. Where can I buy some of this black powder? You can't buy it as far as I know, he said. You've got to mix it up. Saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. That's what we need. Can you get it? So mark that those three things are what Quentin is telling Sonny he needs to get. I wasn't certain, but I wasn't going to let him know it. I'll get right on it. Quentin grinned broadly and suddenly started to rattle on like I was his best friend. He opened up his briefcase and showed me all the books within, most of them on general science, but one of them, a novel titled Top Tropic of Cancer. You want to know about girls? This is the one, he said slyly. I already know about girls. He tapped the book. No, you don't. When the bell rang and we stood up, I noticed for the first time Quentin's worn, faded shirt, thin at the elbows, and his patched cotton pants, and his scuffed ankle-high shoes. Quentin wasn't a Colwood boy. He came from Bartley. So you need to know that too, because it mentions something important about him. He was one of the kids my mother told me to notice. The mine at Bartley was always having cutoffs and strikes, and in the last few years, many Bartley families had slid into poverty and misery. Quentin's father was probably out of a job. In 1957, southern West Virginia, you wouldn't likely starve if you didn't have any money. There was always bread and commodity cheese you could get from the government, but that was about all there was. So basically, the people right now where Sonny are living, they're still doing okay. But people in other areas, remember they talk about the coal mines have been having to lay people off. They've been shutting down. So Quentin, it's kind of obvious, Sonny thinks, by what he's wearing, that his family must kind of be in a financial bind. Roy Lee stopped me in the hall. What were you talking about to that moron Quentin about? And did I see you holding his hand? We're at the top of 76. I was peeved enough at Roy Lee to not answer. Remember, he's peeved because he told him he wasn't going to help him build rockets anymore. But then I figured it would aggravate him more to tell the truth. We're going to build a rocket, him and me. A surge of kids passed us, Dorothy plunk among them. Hi, Sonny, Roy Lee, she called angelically. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Roy Lee shook his head and leaned against the lockers. God almighty. You want to stop all chance of ever having any kind of social life? Dorothy Plunk sees you and Quentin hanging out together. She's going to lose interest right there. I looked after her, trying not to stare at her cute little self swinging back and forth down the hall. Dorothy doesn't care anything about me anyway, I said, sort of breathless. Roy Lee didn't try to hide what he was looking at. He watched Dorothy all the way down the hall. Whew, he whistled. He pulled his eyes back at me. You got good taste anyway, Sonny. Why don't you ask her out? Double date with me next weekend. We'll go parking at the Coretta Fan. She'd just say no. Roy Lee shook his head again as if I was the burden of his life. If you don't ask her out, I will. You wouldn't do that, I bleated. He wiggled his eyebrows at me, his crooked grin clearly salacious. Oh, but I would. Roy Lee had me in a box. If he asked Dorothy out and she went, I wasn't sure I could live through it, knowing what Roy Lee was likely to try with her. And what if she did it? Or if Roy Lee claimed she did? My life would be pretty much ruined forever. I had no choice. I chased after Dorothy, catching her with Emily Sue at the entrance to biology class. I'm sorry I got sick over the worm, Dorothy said, first thing. Dorothy, I said, my heart pounding in my ears, would you like to go to the dance with me Saturday night? With Roy Lee? In his car? Her big blues blinked, but I already have plans. The blood drained from my face. Oh. But if you'd come over to my house on Sunday afternoon, she purred, I'd love to study biology with you. To her house? I'll be there, I swore. What should I bring? Just yourself, silly. She looked me over, studying me, and I kind of thought she liked what she was seeing. We'll have so much fun, she concluded. Emily Sue had been observing all this. Be a little careful with this one, Dorothy, she said. Whatever do you mean? Dorothy asked her friend. They talked to each other as if I weren't even there. Sonny's nice, Emily Sue said succinctly. Well, so am I, Dorothy said back. She went on into the classroom. Roy Lee had been loitering nearby listening. He came up and stood beside Emily. What do you think? He said. They were talking as if I weren't there, too. Dangerous, Emily Sue told him. but probably not fatal. During class, I couldn't help but sneak looks at Dorothy at her desk while she worked on a drawing of frog intestines. She had the adorable habit of letting the pink tip of her tongue protrude from her full, delectable lips while she concentrated. She was wearing a white pinafore blouse with a blue ribbon around its collar, which made her look so very innocent. She caught me looking once and gave me a demure little smile while I blushed. I couldn't figure out how so much perfection could wind up in one person. Then a little misery inserted itself. If Dorothy had plans for Saturday night, I didn't imagine it was to bake cookies with her mother. So just mention from page 77 that Sonny asked her out, and even though she said no to Saturday, she did invite him over to her house to study biology. So he's excited about that. He can't wait. So we are on 78. There was a company store system in most of the towns in southern West Virginia. They usually featured easy credit and inflated prices. So you need to mark that. Company store, easy credit, inflated prices. If a miner got into enough debt with a company store, the company stopped paying the miner with U.S. dollars and issued his pay in the form of scrip. Company money, good only in the company store. You need to mark that because we've talked about that, okay? It was an insidious system. A popular song, oh my gosh, y'all, I played this song for you. A popular song across the country in the late 1950s was Tennessee Ernie Ford's 16 Tons, where he sang about a miner owing his soul to the company store. That was just about the truth for a lot of West Virginia miners. As part of his social agenda, the captain abolished the worst aspects of the company store system in Coalwood. So you need to say that too, that the captain abolished the system. He brought in a college-educated manager, Mr. Devotee Dantzler, a Mississippi gentleman, to make certain prices were kept fair and no miner was gouged. So you need to mark all of that. That was a terrible system, that people would get in debt to the company store. But the captain wanted to stop that because, remember, he did want to help the people. And so he brought in Dantzler, Mr. Devotee Dantzler, to make certain the prices were kept fair and no miner was gouged. Gouged is when you charge way too much money for something. It's kind of like when we have had a shortage on gasoline at times when there were different storms. And some gas stations would gouge customers and raise the prices because, as you know, if something is more in demand, the prices rise. And you've had to have governors come in and tell the gas stations they cannot do that because people couldn't afford it. The captain dictated that credit could be given when necessary, but the books were to be watched closely. No miner was allowed to get himself too far in debt. Scrip in Coalwood was issued sparingly. Smaller stores were built around the town for the convenience of the population. Under Mr. Dantzler, the big store became a source of town cohesiveness and a social gathering spot. So you do need to note that. That whole paragraph is pretty important. And the big store was a source of town cohesiveness. It means it drew people together. So kind of like a hangout for people to come and just hang out and get closer to each other. The big store contained a little bit of everything. Hard-toe boots, leather utility belts, helmets, coveralls, and the cylindrical lunch buckets the miners favored. Clothes for the whole family, groceries and umbrellas, refrigerators, baby carriages, radios, and television sets with free installation onto the company cable system. Remember, he provided the company cable system to him for free. Remember that? Pianos, guitars, record players, and a record department, too. It had a drugstore where you could get doc's prescriptions and a wide variety of patent medicines, and a soda fountain where you could get pop and candy and a milkshake so thick a spoon would stand straight up in it. It had auto parts and lumber, shovels, picks, rakes, and seeds for the little gardens the miners scraped into the sides of the mountains. It even had a limited choice of coffins hidden away in a back room. It was technically illegal to bury anyone on company property, but the colored people had a cemetery somewhere up Snakewood Hollow. My father and the company looked the other way on it. So that basically that store has everything, y'all, from food to coffins. Isn't that wild? The big store had just about everything anybody in Colwood needed, but would it have rocket fuel? With my cigar box of dollars and script left from my defunct newspaper delivery business, remember defunct is one of your words, I went to Junior, the clerk at the drugstore. You do need to know who Junior is, that he is the clerk at the drugstore. I went to Junior at the drugstore counter to find out. Junior was a rotund little man with a cherubic face, one of your words, who was as smart as a whip and liked all over the town. When Junior worked on the store truck that delivered heavy things like refrigerators in the afternoon, he was welcome to come right into anybody's house, even though he was a Negro. Most of the ladies loved him, even petted him a little. He rarely got away from them after delivery without some tea or coffee and cake. I saw him once in Mom's kitchen admiring her mural. Remember her painting of the beach? Mom was beaming. It was rumored that Junior had once attended college, which put him ahead of even my father. Junior heard my order and cocked his head doubtfully. "Saltpeter?" he demanded in his raspy voice. "Your folks sent you after that?" "It's for me," I said forthrightly. "Science project. I need sulfur and charcoal, too." So we are now on page 80. Junior adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and seemed to make a mental calculation. Then he went into the back and brought out a can, each of sulfur and saltpeter, and a 10-pound bag of cooking charcoal. "Listen, Rocket Boy," he said, "this stuff can blow you to kingdom come. I think you know what I'm saying." I rumbled, "Yes, sir," and paid with scrip. I loaded my treasures on my bike and rode home. As I passed a line of miners walking to work, Mr. Dubonnet, remember the union leader, held me down. "I hear you're going to build another rocket," he said. "Yes, sir. I'm thinking about going down to Cape Canaveral and joining up with Werner von Braun." He seemed to brighten at the news. "That's a good thing. You're too smart to stay here." The line of coal cars beside us suddenly began slamming against each other just before being pushed to the tipple. It was as loud as 100 car wrecks happening all at once, but no one, including me, even bothered to look in its direction. We heard that sound every day. "Mr. Dubonnet, you're smart, too," I said in an attempt to figure out why everybody lately seemed to want me out of town. "After the war, why did you come back to West Virginia, if it's so bad?" He laughed. He had a deep, rich, ho-ho-ho kind of laugh that was wonderful to hear. You got me there, Sonny." He began to walk, and I pushed my bicycle beside him. "I guess these old mountains, the mines, the people, get in your blood," he said. "When I got back from overseas, I couldn't wait to get home to McDowell County. It's where I belong." There was the thing. He'd hit right on what I'd been wondering about since Mom's backyard lecture. "How do you know I don't belong here too?" I wondered. He stopped and raised his eyebrows as if I had said the most amazing thing. I guess my ignorance was a continuing surprise to everyone in Colwood. "Well, you do, of course," he answered. "Anybody raised here belongs here. You can't belong anywhere else." I like that quote. I would underline that and just make a note that Mr. Dubonnet said that in response to Sonny when he wondered, "How do you know I belong here?" Because his mom wants him to get out of there. He is starting now to look past Colwood, but, up until now, Colwood's been great to him. The empty coal car shrieked at the locomotive, perhaps a mile down the track, began to push them toward the waiting temple. I shouted to be heard. "Then I don't understand why I'm supposed to leave." He stopped again, the other miners passing us by at a hard slog, the shift change hour approaching. "Don't you understand?" he yelled. "In just a few years, all of this will be gone, almost like it never existed." Remember, that's what Sonny's mom's been telling him, too. The coal cars began to roll, and the noise lowered to a deep rumble. Mr. Dubonnet lowered his voice with them. "Even the union can't put the coal back in the ground." I knew I probably shouldn't ask him anything about my father, considering the row I'd observed between them. But I couldn't resist. "Does my dad know this?" Mr. Dubonnet grimaced. "He knows, but he acts like he don't." "How come?" "Now that's something you should ask him," Mr. Dubonnet said, his face turning as hard as concrete. "Good luck with your rocket, Sonny." He joined the line of men and quickly disappeared, one black helmet in a river of black, bobbing helmets. all going up the path to the tipple. I looked back down the valley at all the houses. Women were out on their front porches with their mops and buckets, waging their never-ending battle against the coal dust. The coal cars kept trundling past until a big black steam locomotive puffing huge gouts of white smoke finally appeared. It churned past, its engineer giving me a wave. I waved back distractedly. With all this activity, I just couldn't imagine it ever ending. Maybe Dad and I had a similar blind spot. Besides the washing machine in the basement was a wide counter and a deep steel sink. I had decided it would be my rocket laboratory. As soon as I set my chemicals on the counter, the upstairs door opened. "Sonny," Mom called, and I yes ma'am'd her. "Remember what I said. Don't blow yourself up." News in Colwood traveled a lot faster than a boy on a bike. So we are on page 82 now. Quentin hitchhiked over on a Saturday, and I introduced him to my mother. He made a short bow with the waist to her, an Errol Flynn kind of move I'm sure he had seen in the movies. Mom was impressed by it, however, her hand going to her mouth almost like a bashful girl's. She rarely baked cookies, but I soon smelled their aroma drifting down from the kitchen. When she thumped down the basement steps with them and 2 glasses of milk, the plate she handed Quentin was piled as high as a mine. "These are marvelous, undoubtedly the most delicious cookies I've ever tasted in the entire history of my life," Quentin told her after a nibble. Mom looked tickled. She wondered what else she could do for us. "Nothing, Mom," I answered. "I just wanted her to leave so we could get to work. She seemed to want to loiter. If you need anything, just call me." "We will, Mom. See you later, Mom." After my mother had gone back to the kitchen, Quentin worked on his cookies for a while I waited patiently. Finally, he took a final swig of milk, wiped his mouth on his sleeve, and picked up the bag of saltpeter. We're at the top of 83. He looked inside. "Looks pure," he said. I wondered how he would know. With Dandy and Petite watching us furtively from a dark nook beside the coal furnace, we began to work. First, we mixed up several small batches of what we hoped was black powder, and as a test, opened the grate and threw a spoonful of each into the coal-fired hot water heater beside the washing machine. The ingredients hissed feebly, but it was impressive enough for the dogs to beg to be let out. I opened the basement door, and they bolted outside. "What do you think?" I asked. Quentin shrugged. Neither of us knew how rocket fuel was supposed to burn. We decided to test 2 of our best mixtures inside devices we hoped resembled rockets. There was some 1-inch wide aluminum tubing under the black porch that Dad had brought home from the mine to make a stand for Mom's bird feeders. I appropriated it with a clear conscience, since it looked as if he were never going to get around to it. I hacksawed off 2 1-foot links. Quentin called the links our casements. We hammered in a short length of broom handle at one end and then poured in our powder mixes, crimping the other end with pliers to form a constriction, the Life magazine diagram called the rocket nozzle. The result was obviously crude, but it was for testing purposes only. We attached triangular cardboard fins with a model airplane glue. We knew the fins would probably burn off, but they would at least give our rockets something to sit on. "We need to see how the powder acts under pressure," Quentin said. "Whatever the result, we'll have a basis for modification." So just know they've got the powder mixed together, and they are using the pipe, the aluminum tubing, that they were going to use for his mom's bird feeder. I was becoming used to Quentin's way of putting things. What he was saying was that we had to start somewhere, either succeed or fail, and then build what we knew as long as we went along. So I love that quote, so underline it. So basically, he's saying even if you fail, you have a basis for what needs to be modified. Okay, you've got to start somewhere, and you're going to fail, and that is how you learn. So I love that quote. Again, what he was saying was that we had to start somewhere, either succeed or fail, and then build what we knew as we went along, so you can continue to make improvements as you fail. It seemed to me, considering, let me turn the page. We are now at the top of 84. Considering all the rockets I'd read about blowing up down at Cape Canaveral, that was the way Werner von Braun and the other rocket scientists did their work too. Without Quentin, I might have been too embarrassed to fail in front of God and everybody. With him, no matter what happened, I felt scientific. Failure, after all, just added to our body of knowledge. So again, mark that on page 84. Failure added to our body of knowledge. I love that because really you don't learn from success. You learn from failure. That was Quentin's phrase too. Body of knowledge. I like the idea that we were building a body of knowledge. After the fins dried, I decided we would test our creations behind my house, over by the creek. I didn't think there was anything over there anybody would care about if it blew up. To my surprise, Roy Lee appeared, claiming he had just happened to be in the neighborhood. I think he'd actually been hanging around, waiting for me and Quentin to come out. The first rocket emitted a boil of nasty, stinking, yellowish smoke and then fell over. The glue on its fins melted. Wonderful, Roy Lee muttered, holding his nose. Quentin silently wrote the result down on a scrap of notebook paper. Body of knowledge. Okay, so just make a note of that the rocket emitted a yellow smoke and then fell over, and then the glue melted on it, okay? The second rocket blew up. A good-sized chunk of shrapnel twanged off the abandoned car we were hiding behind. A cloud of oily smoke covered us. Dad came out on the back porch and yelled, "Sonny, get over here right now." Obediently, we followed the smoke, reaching him as it did. He wrinkled his nose. "Didn't I tell you not to do this again?" I didn't get a chance to answer. Mom came out. "Homer, telephone." She gave us boys a little smile while she waved the smoke away from her. So you could just see, like, she kind of saved the boys there. Dad went after the call and then came back on the porch. He ignored Quentin and Roy Lee, his eyes on me. As soon as I put the phone down, it rings again. "People are complaining about the stink and smoke. I want this stopped. Do you understand me?" Mom quickly amended his meaning. "Not behind the house, dear. You need to find a better place." Dad turned on her. "Elsie, they've got to stop trying to burn Coalwood down." She kept her smile on us boys. "Okay, I'll make them promise. You won't burn this wonderful, beautiful city down, will you, boys?" And, of course, she's being smart aleck when she says beautiful city. "No, ma'am," we chorused. "You see." Dad stared at her and then shook his head and went inside. She followed him, leaving us boys to contemplate what had been, after all, our scorched, stinking failures. Quentin finished his notes. "First sample was too weak. The second too strong," he said. "Now we know where we are. This is very, very good." So see, some boys would just want to give up thinking, we just can't get it. But he's like, this is good. We're knowing, this is too weak, this is too strong, so we know we have to go somewhere in between. Across the creek, some younger children gathered, dirty, snot-nosed urchins all. "Hey, rocket boys, why don't your rockets fly?" they chorused. Roy Lee picked up a rock and they scattered, giggling. I hitchhiked to War on Sunday afternoon. Dorothy's house was across the railroad tracks on the mountain that overlooked the town. Her mother welcomed me with a delighted grin, as if she never wanted to see anybody more in her life. I could see a little of Dorothy in her face. But, unlike her daughter, she was a big, robust woman. Although Dorothy's hair was a sandy color, her mother's hair was the color of an orange. Dorothy's father, a lanky, nearly bald man, stepped in from the kitchen and listlessly shook my hand. The owner of a gas station in War, I could tell he was used to Mrs. Plunk doing most of the talking. Both parents disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me and Dorothy in the living room with our biology books. As it turned out, we didn't study much. She wanted to know all about my rockets. I'm so proud just to know somebody who does something so interesting. Emboldened, I told her I was going to try to learn as much as I could and go down to Cape Canaveral and join up with Werner von Braun. "Oh, Sonny," she said, "I know you're going to be an important person someday. When you get to Florida, will you write me and tell me all about it?" I struggled to find the nerve to tell her I didn't want to write her, that I wanted her to be there by my side. But before I could find my voice, she said, "I want to be a teacher and a mom, the best one that ever was. I so love children." "So do I exclaimed, although it was news to me. If Dorothy wanted it, I did too. We continued talking about friends and our parents. I told her about my mother, all the little funny things she did, about Chipper, her squirrel she kept in the house, and her mural on our kitchen wall. When I described Dad, all I could say was that he was in charge of the mine and worked a lot at it. And yes, he had caused the suit to be filed on behalf of the Big Creek team. "What's it like to be Jim's brother?" Dorothy asked, even though I hadn't mentioned him. I really had never given that particular subject much thought. "Okay, I guess," was the best I could do. "He's such a good football player." I shrugged. I don't think this is going in the direction Sonny wants it to go. "I think you're much more interesting," she said. That brightened me up. It seemed like the right moment to ask her out on a date. "Dorothy, you know Roy Lee has a car, and I was just thinking that maybe you and me—" "Do you know what, Sonny?" she interrupted. "I've never been outside of West Virginia. Isn't that sad? How about you?" Her question caused my own to die on my lips. I told her I'd been several times to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Mom loved it there too. And Dad had driven the family to Canada when I was in the 3rd grade, all the way to Quebec. She seemed thrilled. "Tell me about Quebec." I remembered how clean everything was. The French language had also made an impression. It sounded real pretty to hear it, I told her. "Someday I'll go there and hear it too," Dorothy said solemnly. I was halfway home before I realized Dorothy had diverted me from asking her out. I resolved to do it the next morning. I scanned the auditorium and found her with a group of her girlfriends huddling around a trio of senior football players. Dorothy was wearing a tight pink sweater and a black poodle skirt and was on her knees in the chair in front of them, her hands covering her mouth as if she laughed at something one of the boys had said. I edged in beside her and stood awkwardly while she bantered back and forth with him. "Saturday night, then?" he asked, and she nodded eagerly. "Oh, hi, Sonny," she said brightly, and then slipped past me to join her future date on a stroll up the aisle. I just stood there, my heart sinking to my toes. If you'll remember, he had asked her out on Saturday night, and she said no. So it wasn't that she had anything going on, because look, she just now has something going on for Saturday night. So it's apparent to me that she likes him, Sonny, because she's interested in all he knows and that he is smart. But poor Sonny, she's not interested in him in the way that he would like her to be interested in him. And she clearly likes the football player type guy, but she likes the intelligence of people like Sonny, but not to go out on a date with. So anyway, we leave off there, and just make a note that he did go to her house, and she ended up asking about Jim, that she was interested in everything that he had to say about rockets, but clearly she's interested in his brother. So anyway, until next time, have a good night.